I'm a huge fan of Western movies. Like, there's just something about Westerns that just speaks to me. I mean, think about like some of maybe your favorite Western movies. I mean, even semi-Westerns like Young Guns is a pretty good movie, all right? Then you've got the classics. You got movies like Conager, great movie. My favorite movie is Tombstone. Y'all seen Tombstone, right? Like y'all know, yeah. Tombstone is a fantastic movie. Now the question is why? I'm truthfully, if we were to say by show of hands, who likes Tombstone? How many would say Tombstone's a good movie? Yeah, come on, that's right. Tombstone is a good movie, and part of it's because of just the fantastic lines that happen throughout that movie. But I think there's something deeper with that, in that you've got a group of guys that go into this town and they're tired. They're done. They're finished being lawmen. They're tired of that. They're wanting a new life. They're wanting to strike gold. They want to make it. They want to live by their own standards. Just kind of lay under the radar. Go by life by their own. They've done their life of service. They're done. But what you see throughout that movie is you see this conflict start to rise, and you see these guys who were once lawmen slowly step back into that role when they see an injustice happening. And I think that's part of the reasons we like Westerns so much, because you've got these figures that are traditionally, dark and mysterious, tough, rough, but they're all at least moral, or on some level there's an ethic there that stands with these people that makes them heroes, that makes us look at them and really appreciate their characters. They're tough, they're quick, at least with a gun. They defend others. I know the list could go on and on as to why we like these Western movies, and so I thought we'd take a couple weeks here. Let's just take advantage of the scene that we have in front of us, and look at some cowboy characteristics in the Old Testament. Some of these guys are good cowboys, and some of these guys are kind of worthless cowboys that we're going to look at this week and leading forward. And today we look at this young man by the name of Joash. What makes these individuals stand out? What makes them fail? What makes them thrive? We're going to look at some principles here, and really, we could talk about some of this is just biblical masculinity. Now, that's a dangerous word in some circles to say today. It's a dangerous word to say. It's seen as a negative thing, a toxic thing in some circles. But I'd suggest that what our world needs desperately today is biblical masculinity. We need men to step up and be men. See, what we don't, sometimes we get this idea that being a man happens at 18 or 21. But what we need to realize is that we have 40-year-old boys walking around, and we can have a 17-year-old man, a 14-year-old man. See, a man is not a notch on your belt. It's not a age you reach. We need biblical men to step up, because that's what's, I would suggest, is killing our society. We need men to stand up, rise up, get their heads out of video games and get busy, get to work, care for their families, their communities, their churches. And we need to teach our young boys to become men, and the value of being a man. The value of working hard. This is kind of a side note, but fathers, mothers, help me here. I was talking with a 16-year-old young man the other day, and I went to shake his hand. And one of the most disgusting things that can happen, young men, if you're listening to me, if you go to shake a man's hand and it feels like a fish in his hand, stop. You're doing it wrong. All right. We need to teach the value of a good handshake and good looking somebody in the eye and saying, "Hello, sir. How are you?" Like, we need that so desperately in our world today. We don't need these fishy handshakes. All right. We don't need this thing, whatever that is. All right. Shake a hand. Look somebody in the eye. We need men to stand up. And so today we look at this guy by the name of Joash. His story starts a little strange. Today, I'm gonna. Part of it will be on the screen. Part of it won't be. In 2 Chronicles chapters 23 and 24, we catch this story. This young man named Joash. In the life of Joash, we'll see the good, the bad, and the ugly. And my friends understand that reference. The rest of you just hang tight. Sometimes reading the Old Testament, it gets a little complicated because you have names that we don't usually use. We have names and relationships are often kind of muddied. And so I'm going to try to catch us up here real quick with Joash and what has happened. Do y'all remember Solomon? Solomon was the last king of Israel when the kingdom was united, and he raised two little bratty sons, basically. His sons were brats, so the kingdom divided thereafter, and they had two nations, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom, Israel, the southern kingdom, Judah. Now, from day one, the kings of Israel, they were all evil. In fact, Scripture says they were evil and they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. That's the constant refrain that happens throughout this time of history. This king rose to power and he was evil and did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. Israel, from day one, they're all evil. They're all terrible. They're all bad. They all did their own thing and didn't lean on the Lord. Judah, on the other hand, a little better, not much, but a little. They would have a good king and a bad king and a good king and four bad kings and maybe a good king or a halfway good king for a while and then bad kings. And so Israel eventually, the northern kingdom, as they continued to be bad, they were destroyed, taken into captivity in 722. Judah, they started off some to a good start, but some turned to evil, as is the case with our man Joash today. During the timeline in Judah, there was a king named Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat was a good king. He did what was good in the eyes of the Lord. But eventually he died, and his son took over, and his son is evil. His reign only lasts 8 years. In fact, I want to read this to you. 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 18. It reads like this. He reigned for 8 years, okay? And this is how it ends. After all this, the Lord struck him in his bowels with an incurable disease. In the course of time, at the end of 2 years, his bowels came out because of the disease, and he died in great agony. His people made no fire in his honor like the fires made for his fathers. He was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned for 8 years in Jerusalem, and he departed with no one's regret. I mean, what a sad picture. He departed with no one's regret. They didn't light a candle for him. They didn't make a fire. I mean, what a miserable existence. They buried him in the city of David, but the chronicler here says, but not in the tomb of the kings. So they buried him, but not like a king. They didn't bury him like others. Like it was really a bad kingship. It was a bad time. He was a bad king. He did what was evil, and no one cared when he died. What a scary thing to consider, men. Women too as well. What a scary thing to consider how we live our lives. One of the questions that stands out to me as I read through these stories of these kings is, am I going to make an impact? Will my life make an impact on this world? Man and woman here, will your life make an impact? Because here's the thing, we all have the opportunity to make an impact. The question is, will we take advantage of that opportunity? Moms, Dad, there are little people that are looking up to us each and every day. We can make a generational impact if we so choose. Well, this guy dies, and his youngest son takes over for him. His youngest son, Ahijah. I've practiced all week. I've practiced saying these names, and then I get up here, and it's all gone, all right? So just bear with me, right? I'm going to say names probably different every time I say them. Bear with me, all right? Just kind of, I kid you not. I sat in my office this week for probably 2 hours with headphones on, and the Google Speech thing saying it out loud for me. I just can't do it. Anyway, I mean, it's better that you know now. Otherwise, it's going to get really confusing, okay? So this guy takes over. He takes over for his dad, who served 8 years. And this guy's terrible as well. He's evil as well. In fact, he only reigns for 1 year, and he dies. And then mom steps in. And that's really what we need to understand. His mom steps in. Look at chapter 22, verse Verse 10. And when Lathiah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the royal family in the house of Judah. I mean, I've heard of bad in-laws, right? I've heard of bad mother-in-laws. Like, I can understand a bad family function, but can you imagine this household, all right? Like, this is nuts. And so grandma comes in, her son dies, and she gets up and she starts wiping out all the royal family, wiping out her kids or grandkids. Like this is an evil, evil woman. Like, this is bad news bears, all right? Times 10. This is bad stuff. So she gets up and she wipes out everyone. And why? Because she is going to retain power. She's going to secure for her the kingdom, the authority. What a doozy, this lady. But, verse 11, but Jehoshaphat, the daughter of the king, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him away from among the king's sons who were about to be put to death. And she put him and his nurse in a bedroom. Jehoshaphat, the daughter of King Jehoram, and the wife of Jehoiada, the priest. Ignore that. She was the sister of this lady, all right? She hid them. And so, verse 12, here's the king. He remained with them for 6 years, hidden in the house of God. So this young man is an infant. The evil queen comes in and starts to wipe out everyone. The queen's sister goes in, takes this baby, and hides him in the house of the Lord. Now, this is significant. This is important because God had promised that the lineage of David would continue. Now, this is a big thing. It's easy to miss here, but understand Satan's attempt here. Satan's attempt here, through this evil queen, is to cancel God's promise. God had promised and said, hey, through the lineage of David, there will be a king who comes. And we know him in New Testament terms as Jesus. The king is going to come. The Messiah will be here through the lineage of David. And Satan's attempt here to ruin God's plan. Do you see this? But while it looks bleak in this moment, it doesn't happen quite like that. He's taken, he remains in the house of the Lord for 6 years. Now, the next chapter is really all about this priest and how he gets Joash then reestablished as the king. There's a coup that happens, and the queen is killed, and everything's good. And so we're going to step up. And now remember, like, this is the backstory to this young man, Joash. Like, he has lived a rough life, hiding in the house of the Lord for several years. Now, when he's 7 years old, in chapter 24, verse 1, when he's 7 years old, he began to reign. The evil queen is put away. She had reigned for 6 years or so, and he reigned for 40 years in Jerusalem. Joash, verse 2, Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Watch this. All the days of Jehoiada the priest. Now that should stand up as we read through Chronicles. That should stand out because it's different in this equation. Usually it's Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and usually it would just end there, or it would say something like all his life. But this one is contingent on the priest. All the days of the priest, Joash did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. The priest got for him 2 wives, and he had sons and daughters. And look at verse 4. Look, as Joash takes his kingship, and now he's growing up, verse 4, he says, he decided to restore the house of the Lord. He decided to restore the house of the Lord. And so he puts in this program. He says, hey guys, look, for several years now, because of my evil grandmother, the house of the Lord has kind of fallen into ruins. And so we're going to fix this. We're going to make this right. And so bring in the taxes from Moses, and we're going to rebuild the house. And as time passes, it doesn't happen as quickly as it ought to. And so I'm giving you the cliff notes here. So Joash goes to the priest again, Jehoiada, and says, hey, why isn't this happening? Why isn't this happening? Why isn't it happening quick enough? It should be repaired, and it's not been. It's been neglected. We can't have that anymore. And so what he does is he does something pretty unique here. He says, okay, I'm going to make a chest. Look at verse 8, I believe. He commanded that a chest be made, and he set outside the gate for the people, the house of the Lord. Now, I don't know if you realize this, but in our foyer, we have a chest of Joash sitting out there in the foyer. We started this campaign a couple years ago when we started launching and dreaming about the building on top of the hill, the Family Life Center, and the impact it's going to make. And so we've been using the chest of Joash. Some people have called it the Chester Joash, which is funny. Chester. Who's Chester? That's just a little too redneck. But the chest of Joash, we've been using this to collect funds, to raise funds, kind of in this type of thing, looking at the future of what's happening here at Leesburg, looking at the future of what's to come. I mean, you've heard it said here, Sammy has said it often here, the best days of Leesburg are yet to come. We're so incredibly excited about what the Lord is doing now and what the Lord is preparing us for in the future. We're excited about this new building going on top of the hill and the impact that it's going to make in our community and providing an environment, a space for our teens, our kids, a place for all kinds of things to happen. We're excited about that. And so you might be familiar with this concept because we've been doing it here. A proclamation was made throughout Judah and Jerusalem to bring in for the Lord the tax that Moses, the servant of God, had laid on Israel in the wilderness. And look what happened in verse 10. And all the princes and all the people, what did they do? They rejoiced. They rejoiced as they brought in their tax and dropped it on the chest until they had finished. There's a principle there that it's easy to overlook. While in this context here, it's using the word tax, and we hear that word, and we understand taxes, don't we? Like, we get taxes, and often we go, ugh, taxes. But look at the people's response with this project that's put before them. They come in with their tax, and they rejoiced as they put it in the offering into the chest of Joash. There's a principle there that's easy for us to forget. It's easy for us to miss, but we all know, and I guess this is a good opportunity to say, many and some newer people have asked, hey, how do we give here? How do we tithe here? How do we do that? We don't pass the plate, and that kind of sense is apart from some other churches. We don't pass the plate here. In fact, instead, what we have at these doors and the doors in the foyer, we have boxes, giving boxes, and we encourage you to give in that regard. We don't pass the plate, and let me explain why we don't do that. There's a couple reasons why. First of all, we don't pass a plate because we don't want it to be a focus. We don't want that to be the focus of what we're doing. Most of us understand that the giving, there's worship that's involved in that. There's rejoicing that's involved in that. When we give, it's a worshipful thing. But in our context, in our culture, often that can be looked at in a weird way. You've probably heard before all those, maybe people have had a bad experience in churches, and there's like, all those churches care about is money. We want to remove those hurdles so that can't be argued against here. And so that's one of the reasons for our boxes. We don't want it to be a focus. We don't want it to be a stumbling block for people that would keep them from engaging with our ministry here. But for many of us, we understand that giving to the cause, it is a reason to rejoice. It is a reason to rejoice and to understand what God is doing with our tithes, with our offerings, with our contributions. It's a good thing. But we don't want it to be a hindrance to people. We don't want to guilt people. I mean, maybe you've never been like this, but I've been like this before. I remember when I was first in ministry, and the church that I was serving at, they passed plates, and there were some days where I want to put money in but I've got a 20, and all I've got's a 20, and I'm thinking, can I make change out of this? Like, will this look weird if, and of course I didn't, and so then what would happen is I'd pass, and then I'd feel guilty, and then I'd go later and try to give in another way, and so we don't want that awkwardness to happen here. We definitely don't want you making change out of the plates. Well, I don't care if you do. I don't care. But I'm sure other people probably don't want you to do that. So we don't want it to be uncomfortable, right? But we do give, and I do want to take a moment and pause and look at how we give here. Of course, you can give in the boxes here. You can also give online. You can give through our mobile app, and you can do that way as well. But we understand, look at their response as they brought their taxes in, their offerings in. They dropped it off and they rejoiced. In verse 14, when they had finished, they brought the rest of the money before the king, Jehoiada, and the king and the priest, Jehoiada, and with him all the utensils of the house of the Lord were made for the service, for the burnt offerings and dishes and all this stuff that they were made. And look at the end of that verse. And they offered burnt offerings in the house of God. It's cut off there, but they offered burnt offerings. They offered the worship has been reestablished in the house of the Lord regularly. It ends that verse saying regularly all the days of the priest. Worship had been reestablished. And I think that's one of the good things that we see in the life of this king. You see, throughout the Old Testament, the king's attitude toward the temple is always the litmus test to his faith. How the king sees the temple is always a litmus test to his faith. It reflects the biblical conviction that the worship of God is of highest priority for every human being. How we see the house of God, how we see the worship of God is a huge litmus test for our faith as well. Do we come in to worship on a weekend? Do we come in out of obligation because it's just what we do? Or let me ask you, do we prepare, and I'd encourage you to consider this, do you prepare your hearts to worship on the way here on Sunday mornings? Do I prepare myself to worship, to be in the presence of God? You know, there are some days, I know it's true and you know it's true. There are some days where we stand here and all we do is sing words. There's a big difference in singing words to God and worshiping God. But that's largely contingent on what I do in my heart. See, we call Matt, for example, we call Matt our worship pastor or our worship leader. But here's the thing, he can't lead me in worship if I'm not ready to be led. The king's attitude toward the temple is a litmus test to his faith. And so we see under the leadership of the priest, we see that Joash starts off his ministry, and it's good because he sees value in placing resources, time, and energy to rebuild and reestablish worship in the house of God. He saw the importance of church. Joash had another biblical man speaking into his life. He didn't do life alone. He did it with biblical guidance, and that's another principle that we can find as well. You know, Josh Turner sings that song. I think it's Josh Turner. I don't know. It might be Josh Turner. That song, Me and God. Nobody comes to me but me and God. I think that's how it goes. Here's the thing. Biblically speaking, it's much more than just me and God. It's we and God. It's us, the body of believers, our faith community here. It's about us. And so I'm so thankful, for example, when I've got these men that speak into my life and they call me and they say, hey man, I saw you yesterday and I saw you looked rough. You sounded rough, you were talking rough, whatever the situation is. Are you okay? Man, that's so important for me. That's so important. It's not just me and God, it's we and God. And we see that as long as Joash has a healthy mentor in his life, someone who's going to speak into his life, we see that Joash does pretty good. He restores worship in the house of God, but sadly that doesn't last forever. Look at verse 15, but then Jehoiada grew old, full of days, and he died. He was 130 at his death. And so they buried him in the city of David among the kings because he had done good in Israel and toward God and his house. Notice the respect, the reverence that the priest is given here. And we're soon going to contrast that with the end of Joash's life. When Joash dies, it's much different. But notice the respect. This priest had done well. He's buried with the king because he had done good in Israel toward God and his house. But soon the bad begins. We've had the good, now here comes the bad. Once his influence is gone, Joash shifts, and we see him not as a leader, but as a follower. See, Joash had done a good job as long as he was following the godly priest. But what happens when he's gone? See, the central term here moving forward in this account are these words: forsake and abandon. Now, when that's the central word in our life moving forward, that's always a dangerous thing. That's what we see several times throughout the rest of this narrative. We see the central term is forsake and abandon, and that should stand out to us. Look at verse 17. Now after the death of the priests, the princes of Judah came and paid homage to the king, and the king listened to them. What a dangerous thing. It's dangerous to listen to your own hype. You know what I mean? I'll confess to you, I've got a natural distaste for any celebrity, because here's what we see in most celebrities, and it's a human nature thing. I think we're all possible of this. We start to believe our own hype about us. You know what I mean? I can guarantee you now, if people follow me around and said, "John, you're awesome. John, you're awesome. John, you're awesome," I would start to believe it. In fact, they don't have to do it now. I already believe it. All right, so. Can you imagine how bad I'd be if people actually followed me around saying, "Hey, dude, you're awesome, you're great"? I would buy into that so easily. And so it's a good thing that, I've got godly people and a wife that says, "Yeah, you're pretty lame, dude." All right? We start to buy into our own hype. When we start to drink our own Kool-Aid, when we start to listen to the news about us, it can get dangerous. And so instead of a godly person speaking into Joash's life, he starts listening to the hype that's being fed into him. They came and they paid homage to the king, and the king listened to them. We have to be very careful, men and women. Who do we listen to? See, it's a very dangerous thing when everyone around you agrees with you. What a beneficial thing for a brother or sister in the faith to say, "Hey, you might be off here." What a beneficial thing, but Joash no longer has that in his life. He started to listening to the people who paid homage to him. Verse 18, and they abandoned the house of the Lord. If you're in your Bible, circle that, underline that. They abandoned the house of the Lord, the God of their fathers, and they served the idols. And wrath came upon Judah and Jerusalem for this guilt of theirs. They stopped worshiping God, and instead they started to worship idols. They neglected God. They abandoned God and his temple. See, throughout the Old Testament, what we see that to neglect God and to turn to other forms of worship is not a neutral choice. Think about that, how that applies to us. It's not a neutral choice. Even for those who previously worshiped faithfully. To abandon God is not to... So, the question then becomes for us today is, what receives my heart's attention? What receives my affection? Where do I put my time, my resources, my thoughts? Listen, we're on the back end of the world shutting down. But I'll tell you now, I fully believe that, and it's just a sad thing, but many people who have stopped coming for whatever reasons, many of those will never come back into a church. Why? Because they found a way to be more comfortable, perhaps. They found a way to be, I can do God on my terms. Even though maybe they had once worshipped faithfully, they've now turned. And that's what happens here with Joash. He turns, and it's not a neutral choice, it's an abandonment. It's not a neutral choice. It's not exchanging one good thing for something else that's good. It's exchanging good for bad. To worship idols is to abandon the temple. And as a result, guilt came upon them and was followed by God's anger. But watch what happens here. I think this is another thing that we can often skip over. Look at what happens. Instead of punishing them at once, which God had every right to do, hey, look, instead of smacking them in the head, he just gave his grandfather, he made his bowels erupt, all right? Like, God can really take care of business if God so chooses. But instead of doing that, instead of punishing them at once, look what he does. He practices patience. It reminds me of 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. Peter writes, "The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, as some count slowness, but he's patient toward you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should turn to repentance." Instead of giving them exactly what they deserve, instead of giving Joash exactly what he deserved, look at the grace given by God. Verse 20 of 2 Chronicles 24. "Then the Spirit of God clothed Zechariah the son of Jehoiada the priest, and he stood above the people, and he said to them, 'Thus says God, why do you break the commandments of the Lord so that you cannot prosper? Because you have forsaken the Lord, he has forsaken you.'" This is not a popular preacher here, okay? But a needed preacher. And this preaching is really a result of God's grace. God could have wiped them out for their disobedience, but instead God sends a prophet to speak to them and say, "Hey, look, why are you turning from God?" Like see this as a picture of God's grace. It's a warning beacon. Guys, hey, look, why are you turning from God so that you can't prosper? And so it's so easy for us to look at this and say, well, that makes sense. Of course not. But we do the same thing. How can we expect prosperity in our lives? And I use that word very sensitively. How do we expect things to go well if we're choosing to live in sin? So often we'll go down this road of sinfulness and we'll say, "Well, God, why aren't you, where are you? You're leaving me here. What's going on here? Why aren't you blessing me? Why aren't you?" And God's saying, "Dude, you're in sin." Zechariah stands, hey, why do you abandon? Of course, if you don't do things God's way, you're not going to be prosperous. Of course. See, we do the same thing time and time again. The message here is follow God's word and you will prosper. Follow God's word. Following God's word, his way of living, it leads to blessing in our lives. Why would we go another way? And guys and gals, this is important. And I'm almost done, but this is important. Consider it today an act of God's grace that you hear this. This is an act of God's grace because none of us are promised tomorrow. None of us are promised another minute. And God can use a donkey, and he's done it before, and so now he can use me to say, "Hey, why do we do different? Why would we choose another way from God?" This is an act of grace today. The fact that we are here today hearing this message and looking at this account in 2 Chronicles is an act of God's grace, and it's an opportunity for each of us to turn back to God, to abandon the false idols and return to the worship of the one true God. So the question is, what have you worshiped this week? What is getting your worship? What's getting your time, your energy, your affections? Is it job? Is it spouse? Is it kids? Is it business? What gets the best parts of you? Consider this an act of God's grace. It continues, and now we start to see the ugly. Verse 21. "They conspired against him," that's Zechariah, "and by the command of the king they stoned him with the stones in the court of the house of the Lord." It's ironic that by the command of the king, the prophet of God is stoned in the same place that the evil queen, we skipped over that, but in the same place that the evil queen was killed. Joash had forgotten really all of the grace, the mercy, the love that was showed out for him from the priest. Verse 22, "But Joash the king, he did not remember the kindness that Jehoiada, Zechariah's father, had showed him, but killed his son. And when he was dying, he said, 'May the Lord see and avenge.'" Oh, what a tragic, ugly turn for Joash. The question is, why does it end like this for him? It seems that his connection to God was always through the priest. He never had a personal faith. Guys and gals, your faith Your relationship with the Lord can't be dependent on whoever's standing up here. It can't be dependent on your spouse. It can't be dependent on your neighbor. It can't be dependent on your small group. You've got to be responsible. Your connection to God is always a personal faith. Verse 23 continues. And at the end of the year, the army of the Syrians came up against Joash, and they came to Judah and Jerusalem and destroyed all the princes and the people from among the people. And they sent the spoil to the king of Damascus. Verse 24, the army of the Syrians had come with few men. Though they had come with few men, the Lord delivered into their hand a very great army, because Judah had forsaken the Lord, the God of their fathers. And thus they executed judgment on Joash. This is really a bad ending. When they departed from him, leaving him severely wounded, his servants conspired against him because of the blood of Jehoiada the priest, and they killed him on his bed. And so he died. And look at the contrast here. And so they buried him in the city of David, but they did not bury him in the tombs of the kings. What a sad ending, and what a strong contrast to the way the priest was buried with the kings. He had done well. Joash ends on a sour note. Look at the path of destruction for Joash. When Jehoiada the priest died, the nation lost a great influence. Joash, a man now in his 30s, should have been able to lead his people in the ways of God, but this man was instead a boy. He was a weak leader, and he listened to those who flattered him. He began to believe his own hype, and soon the house of the Lord was abandoned for worship in the idols in the high places. So as we wrap up this, and I'm almost done, I promise, but I want to encourage us today to look at a few themes here that stand out that are very important. God had promised to see through David's lineage that it would lead to the Messiah, and God always keeps his promise, even though it looked very dark there at one point. When the evil grandmother comes in and wipes out all the kids, it looks very dark. It looks very grim. How in the world can God fulfill his promise? What we see here and what the chronicler points out to us is that God always keeps his promise, even in the bad times. Even when things are rough, God keeps his promise. Regardless of how dark it might be, God always gets his way. Another thing we should see here is Joash failed to ignite a true relationship with God. He followed Jehoiada the priest. He followed those who flattered him. The question for us is, who am I following? Am I following a godly influence, or am I believing the hype that's spat into me? Over the next few weeks, we're going to look at a few other men in the Old Testament, cowboys of the Bible, if you will. And we're going to see the high points, we're going to see the low points. But the big thing I want to point out are these principles that we see painted time and time again throughout the Scriptures. Of these characteristics that we need to pick up. And we need to pick these up in a very important way, because our influence is going to matter, just like these kings are now read about thousands of years later. It's my prayer that we can leave a lineage. And that's the Lord returns, and if he does, that's great and fine, wonderful. But I hope that our kids and our great-grandkids will look back at our lives and say, man, Papaw did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And there was a blessing throughout our family, a generational blessing that has continued because of this man's influence, this woman's influence. I want to look at these accounts, and I want to see that develop. What we see here is God's faithfulness. God's faithfulness even when times are tough, even when times are dark. And it should give us the courage to stand strong today. Regardless of whatever attacks might come our way, regardless of whatever frustration might build upon us, it should give us courage to stand up strong today, knowing that God gets his way. And there's a simple way that we're reminded of that each and every week. God gets his way. It starts back in the book of Genesis in chapter 3, immediately following the fall of Adam and Eve. God says, I'm going to send one. You'll strike his heel and he will crush your head. And that prophecy developed time and time and time over the centuries, over the years. God continued to elaborate on that promise until finally, John chapter 1 tells us the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Word became flesh, made his dwelling among us. He lived a perfect, sinless life, and then he eventually went to the cross. That's what we celebrate each week when we come around this bread and this cup. We are reminded that God always gets his way. God is always faithful, even when we're not.